19th century feminists often claimed to speak for the vulnerable from a position of empathy that made their perspectives uniquely valuable. But when Hester Vaughn killed her newborn baby, feminists' rage at men far outweighed their sympathy for Vaughn's dead infant. I'm Janice Fiamingo, and this is the Fiamingo File 2.0. The case of Philadelphia resident Hester Vaughn, who was tried and convicted of first-degree murder in the death of her newborn baby, is one of the most infamous cases of infanticide in American history, not only because of the sensational nature of the crime, but also because of the manner in which feminist leaders seized on the incident to advance an anti-male agenda with lasting consequences. The History Channel's website informs readers today that the trial, quote, exposed sexual harassment, and that Hester Vaughn's dead baby, quote, became a symbol in the fight for equal rights. As we'll see, it wasn't quite that simple. The full details of Vaughn's story are lost in history, but the facts about the murder of her infant were beyond a reasonable doubt. According to the coroner at Vaughn's trial, which took place in July of 1868, Vaughn's baby's skull had been crushed with a blunt instrument and the tiny body severely beaten. No one but Vaughn could have committed the crime, as Vaughn was alone in her boarding house room following the baby's birth, having denied she was pregnant and refused offers of assistance. She was convicted of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. There was nothing particularly unusual in this young woman's crime, as infanticide was common in the 19th century English-speaking world. Exact numbers of the dead are impossible to determine, but the crime was frequent enough to alarm medical authorities and for the subject to figure in many popular novels of the time, including foremost English writer George Eliot's 1859 novel Adam Bede, in which sympathy is evoked for the child killer Hetty Sorrel. Feminist historian Constance Backhouse reports that, quote, infanticide was an unsavory but surprisingly common feature of life in the 19th century. Law professor Sarah Beringer Gordon, who has written a comprehensive account of the Vaughn case, reports that, quote, in 19th century Philadelphia, thousands of dead newborns were found in alleys, ash heaps, privies, rivers, and so on. Doubtless many more were never discovered, or if found, never reported or recorded. And she goes on to note that, quote, one historian has even speculated that women may actually have committed more murders than men if infanticides are added into the total number of other forms of homicide, end quote. What was unusual in the case of Hester Vaughn was the severity of her sentence, death by hanging, which may have resulted from the unambiguous nature of the killing. Infanticide was a crime rarely prosecuted and even more rarely punished, as juries were disinclined to pronounce guilty verdicts on the often forlorn women brought before them, especially if it was possible that the baby may have died accidentally or of natural causes. Professor of history Anne Higginbotham gives examples from 19th century London to show that, quote, juries were extraordinarily reluctant to convict women accused of murdering their illegitimate infants, end quote, often out of sympathy for the women's difficult circumstances. The judge in the Vaughn case seemed to feel the need to justify his harsh penalty, telling the courtroom that infanticide had become so common that at least one woman needed to be made an example of. Vaughn was taken into custody to a Philadelphia jail to await her execution. As we'll see, however, it's unlikely her death sentence was ever to be carried out. There hadn't been a woman hanged in Philadelphia since 1737, and Vaughn was eventually pardoned and released. But while she was still being held in jail, American feminist leaders began to agitate on behalf of Vaughn, creating an emotionally compelling story that presented her as a victim of forces beyond her control. Benefiting from the fact that relatively little was known about Vaughn, feminists collaborated to portray her as a classic victim heroine in a narrative of wronged innocence. In the pages of their feminist newspapers and in their public speeches, they rewrote the story of guilt that had been established in the courtroom, transforming Vaughn into a persecuted maiden and a loving but desperate mother. And even as they used Vaughn's allegedly agonized motherhood as a plank of appeal, they notably failed to focus any of their sympathies on the battered infant, which of necessity was quietly buried rhetorically in order for Vaughn's suffering as a neglected girl, not a neglectful mother, to take center stage, and for all blame to be shifted to the allegedly cruel patriarchal state. In the end, as I said, Vaughn was pardoned for her crime. Whether she would have been pardoned without the feminist agitation remains unclear, but what is most relevant for our purposes was the extreme willingness of feminist leaders to embroider a story with little factual underpinning in order to advance the case for Vaughn's innocence and their utter indifference to her child's death. The bare facts about Hester Vaughn include that she was an immigrant from England who had found work in Philadelphia as a domestic servant. While employed, she became pregnant and was dismissed from her position. Accounts of how she became pregnant, whether by a consensual affair or through rape, varied greatly. She killed her baby in secret, probably by striking the baby's head repeatedly on a bedpost, and disposed of the child under the bed. Feminist advocates declared Vaughn wrongfully convicted and set about emphasizing her powerlessness. Members of the Working Women's Association held a mass New York City rally on her behalf, visited Vaughn in prison, and petitioned the Pennsylvania governor for her pardon. In the pages of The Revolution, the feminist newspaper run by feminist leaders Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, Stanton used all the rhetorical embellishments at her command to downplay the fact of the murder and to depict Vaughn as a victim. In her editorial for The Revolution on August 6, 1868, shortly after Vaughn's sentencing, Stanton called her, quote, a poor, ignorant, friendless, and forlorn girl who had killed her newborn child because she knew not what else to do with it. As we'll see, this assessment of Vaughn as a bewildered killer was later revised, perhaps Stanton feeling it was a little too cavalier to be effective. Stanton's purpose in this first editorial was to deflect attention from the fact of baby murder by focusing on the allegedly predatory institutions, judge and jury, legislature, church, that had, quote, seduced and condemned a poor young woman. Stressing Vaughn's youth, ignorance, and aloneness, Stanton declared that if her death sentence were not commuted, quote, her death will be a far more horrible infanticide than was the killing of her child, end quote. Then just over 3 months later, on November 19, 1868, Stanton wrote another editorial about Vaughn, this time radically embellishing Vaughn's story so that she wasn't only a victim of the male legal system, but of a sexually exploitative employer. In Stanton's new telling, Vaughn had sought employment from a respectable-looking man who had, quote, proved her betrayer. This man, whom Vaughn refused to identify out of a sense of honor towards his wife, had raped her and then turned her out into the street when her pregnancy became known. In Stanton's version, no one lifted a finger to help Vaughn in the boarding house as she gave birth, terrified and ill, in an entirely empty room. Quote, in vain she had called for help. No one heard or heeded her cries. Feverish with pain and thirst, she dragged herself to the door to beg some passer-by for water. And when at last help came, she was found in a fainting condition and the dead child by her side. The strong implication in Stanton's representation was that the baby had died not through any deliberate act of Vaughn's, but because Vaughn had fainted on the baby or possibly had been maddened by grief and pain, unaware of her actions. Stanton assured readers that Vaughn had wanted to love her baby, but was prevented from doing so because of prejudice against unwed mothers, such that, quote, the deepest and holiest affections of a mother's nature must of necessity be crushed in concealment, end quote. Stanton emphasized that Vaughn's trial had taken place, quote, with most inadequate proof, and that she had been unjustly abandoned by the women of Philadelphia, whom Stanton exhorted to advocate for Vaughn as if she were their own daughter, lamenting that, quote, in the great state of Pennsylvania, not one woman has protested against the barbarism of this whole procedure, nor petitioned Governor Geary for the girl's life. Stanton wrote, quote, in the name of womanhood, we implore the mothers of that state to rescue that defenseless girl from her impending fate. Oh, suppose your young and beautiful daughter had been thus betrayed. Would it not seem to you that the demands of justice should take the life of her seducer rather than her own, end quote. This idea that a woman's alleged seducer should be found equally guilty or even solely guilty in a case in which a woman killed her illegitimate baby was quite common at this time. British barrister E. Belfort Bax mentions it in his book, The Fraud of Feminism, as, quote, one of the proposals which finds most favor with the sentimental feminists, end quote. Stanton did not confine her anger to the man she imagined, without proof, to have raped Vaughn. She also lashed out at all men who had made the law in order to excuse themselves and victimize women. Quote, men have made the laws cunningly, she wrote, for their own protection, and ignorantly, for they can never weigh the sorrows and sufferings of their victims, end quote. The only problem with Stanton's and other similar stories circulating at this time was that the key facts didn't apply to Vaughn, who had confessed her guilt a week after her sentencing, not mentioning rape or accidental death of her baby or any of the mitigating circumstances proclaimed by her defenders. In early December, at the height of the furor over her case, Vaughn had signed an affidavit stating that the father of her child was not her employer and that she had never claimed he was, and that she didn't know whether the man was married or not. And the portrayal of her as forced to give birth alone and without any options was also a feminist concoction. At trial, it had been shown that women from Vaughn's boarding house had come forward offering to assist her in her labor and had been refused, with Vaughn even denying that she was pregnant, a fact clearly seeming to indicate that Vaughn had planned before the birth to secretly kill and dispose of the child. Philadelphia in the late 1860s was a city with many organizations committed to raising illegitimate children. According to Holly Caldwell's web article, the Orphan Society of Philadelphia had been established in 1814 and operated continuously throughout the 19th century, along with various religious houses such as the St. Joseph's Orphan Asylum. Illegitimacy did carry social stigma, but it was not as total or heartless as Stanton depicted, and Vaughn could have placed her child in one of these orphan asylums. Moreover, John White Geary, the Republican governor of Pennsylvania, disputed Stanton's claim that Vaughn was without advocates, mentioning that local Philadelphia women had already petitioned him about Vaughn at a much earlier date before Vaughn became a feminist cause, and that he had already indicated to Vaughn's Philadelphia supporters that she would not be put to death. Contrary to what Stanton alleged, and what is commonly believed today, the American legal system was historically far more lenient with women than with men. In May of 1869, Governor Geary did at last pardon Vaughn and released her from prison on condition that she leave for England immediately. She did so and wrote some months later asking for the $300 that she had heard feminists had raised for her. The Vaughn case exposes the difficulty at the heart of feminist activism, still evident today, when it involves real women, sometimes rather nasty ones, who do not fit the mold of the suffering innocent that feminists prefer to construct. To be fair, Vaughn probably had a hard life, as many working-class women and men did, but she was also a woman who made the choice to kill her baby. Feminist agitation on her behalf showed the willingness of activists to fabricate a victim story that overlooked the truly powerless being who had been destroyed. The enthusiasm with which feminist activists rallied around Hester Vaughn strongly indicated that they were more determined to vilify men and complain of alleged double standards than to pursue truth and justice. Then, as now, they were quite willing to excuse an infant's murder if it helped them advance their anti-male agenda.